Now we will be having our session with respected Rami Niranjan Desai, Founder Director, Northeast Policy Institute, and distinguished member, India Foundation. So ma'am has some already written questions with her, and it will be more comfortable for her to sit because it's going to be a long session.
So I'm not sure how many of the people who send me the questions are still here. So maybe I'll call out the name, and if you're still here, then I'll answer it. I need to wear my glasses. Ananda? No, Ananda is not here. Pokramban Vineet Singh? He's there. So the question was, if not separate administration, will you suggest to which all the communities will agree? Tough question. But I think, I don't think a separate administration to the extent of a state within a state or anything that implies that would be acceptable to any party. But I do think if there is some amount of ceding of space in terms of coming to some common ground, maybe coming out with a creative idea or an idea in terms of giving them more powers to have legislative execution powers as well as financial decision-making powers might be helpful, but that is something for the state to decide, something for the people of the state to decide if it's acceptable or not. But I think the key here is to be able to cede space on both ends and to build some amount of common consensus. You're not going to get 100% of what you want, you know. So that would be my limited take on that. The next question is by Ajoykam Robertson. Hi.
If we still have the audience or delegates who asked the question, please kindly stand up when ma'am announces the name so that she'll be more comfortable while giving the answer.
Just keep answering the questions, even if they aren't here. All right, okay. So, biased reports and discussions of most of the national media have become a stumbling block to dialogue to ensure something of peace in violence from Manipur. Do you think that the standards of national media stoop too long in forms of the professional ethics? I think I mentioned this as well while I was speaking. I think what has happened with national media, and unfortunately so, that media has become political media. You know, media is not about journalism. There was a time, if you remember, that there used to be long-form documentaries and research videos that they would do. You know, today it's only about trending topics. And attention spans have become so short that I think it's a two-way thing. You know, the media is limited by the fact that they need to depend on their TRPs. And those TRPs come only from sensational topics, which is one of the things that upsetted me during this conflict, is because when all the great stuff was happening in the Northeast, when development was happening in the Northeast, they weren't really covering it. The minute this conflict happened, they decided to cover it. And they decided to cover it for a long time, as long as the conflict was escalating, not when the conflict was coming down. So of course, there is a question of what is the kind of ethics that media follows, but also what is the quality of media personnel that we have today. You know, the Editors Guild report, which I have I've taken serious offense to. Somebody said while I was on TV, somebody said, well, it's not a big deal that, you know, the photograph they used was wrong. If that was an academic paper, you'd be failed, you know, and this goes out in public. It builds consensus. You have an influence on people. And in a time like this, when things are still really sensitive, this is absolutely irresponsible. Therefore, one of the last points that I made was that journalism is not a garb for propaganda peddling. So I agree with you.
Ma'am, we feel that most of the national media takes the narratives of the other community at face value. So they are biased reporters and the discussions fuels the unrest more and more instead of dousing the flames. So, what do you make of this first question? And the second part of the question, do you think that some national medias need to be ran in?
Need to be, sorry, what?
Ran in control.
So I don't think you can really control the media as much as I'd like to. But what you said is quite right, you know. The problem is that it's very sensational, it's very woke, it's very fashionable today to look at things in binaries that are long gone past, you know, in colonial binaries. So everything that happens there is superimposed here. And that is fashionable. So for example, and I've said this in many of my talks, that you know, they looked at this immediately. When this conflict happened, they looked at it as BJP, non-BJP, you know, Hindu, Christian. You know, this is basic research is also sort of lacking in this. So of course, you know, for them that's biased because that sort of communal narrative brings them a lot more TRP, a lot more people get interested. You know, if you were to now start explaining that, you know, these are the nuances of this conflict. You know, forget the conflict also. If you start explaining who the Meiteis are, you know, you'll start seeing their eyes glazing, you know, because they stop even concentrating, you know, and it's not really that complicated. So I have to agree with you that, of course, there are these biases, and these biases have existed before also, you know, so this idea that we have that, and I'm not saying that there are good reporters. I know some great editors, you know, I know people who've tried to keep, I'll name a magazine, if you read Open Magazine, you know, it's a balanced view, you know, it'll give you the other view also. You may not like some of its views, but it puts forth all views that are there. Now, that's quality magazines, you know, but they barely can take out 2 editions a month. So obviously everything's run by money, there are biases. We still have a lot of media people who come from a different school of thought. You know, the new generation of media is still to head these media houses. They haven't at this point still become editors. And I hope that some changes come, but you know, at this point it's unlikely. Do you think you could help me with this?
Mem is here with us because of the crowd support that we just had in the morning. So like, instead of making it one way by just reading out and like, if they are not present, I think it will be better for the audience to like communicate verbally.
Yeah, because maybe this might take a little more time. So if you want to raise any questions.
Anybody, like, any question? Yes. Please introduce yourself before asking the question. Thank you.
Well, my name is Yurus Nithimsa, and I already came to you this afternoon. I think you still have that question with you there.
Yeah, yeah.
Or do you want me to rephrase it?
No, I mean, your question is given the context of the current ethnic clash in Manipur. The central forces, particularly AR, seem to be a bit more lenient towards the Kuki-Zo community. In this regard, how does the central government enacting concerning the Myanmar connection, maintaining the status quo in the northeast, as to keeping it as the cushion against
external aggression,
establishing narco economy? So I understand your first part of your question, you know, and that's casting doubt on Assam Rifles.
Not only Assam Rifles, I'm talking about the central forces as whole, but particularly Assam Rifles in this particular scenario specifically. And then what I want to know is like, I told you, I mean, I already raised concerns like if the central government has certain interests, vested interests, like the Myanmar factor, because they have so many projects coming up which are based in those areas where the Kuki-Zos are there. And then that might be one factor of apprehension for the central force, for the government, and then the Meitei factor in relation with the colonial perspective, because the Meiteis are seen as a threat by the central government, Because in the entire northeastern region, if you look at the past, our glorious past, if you look at the arts and culture and sports and all kinds of all walks of life, respectable walks of life, Meitei represents a lot. So maybe they want to subdue the Meiteis, and then they want to make it a common playing field for the other communities. So because Meitei is already reigning, is already controlled.
Sir, I would have to respectfully disagree with you. And the reason I disagree with you is a lot of this is conjecture. You know, I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever for the central government to have any vested interest in keeping this area unstable when in the last 6 years it has seen relative stability. Number two, the infrastructural projects that are coming up or were coming up in the Northeast, you know, were an indication of how they wanted increased connectivity. 10 years ago, if you flew to Manipur, you wouldn't find a direct flight. You know, we've seen that, you know, I don't want to go into our infrastructure projects, but we've seen that. You know, so for the central government, and any government that it may be, keeping, specifically this government, because, you know, they've made the Act East policy as a central part of their foreign policy, to keep Manipur stable actually is a priority for them. This is the reason that they've invested the kind of money in the Asian Trilateral Highway. This is the reason that they have kept the relationship, irrespective of international pressure, with Myanmar neutral. This is the reason that we are at the peak of our relationship with Bangladesh because of the projects that are going to go through these areas. And the first point of benefit is going to be Manipur, because the entry point is going to be via More. So if the central government had any sort of dubious intentions, these are not the kind of initiatives they would have taken via Manipur. They would have taken it through another state, you know. Having said that, about your question about Assam Rifles or Central Forces, as a policy, I refrain from commenting or criticizing the forces. Having said that, I have had many long dialogues with very senior personnel from Assam Rifles, and they have a long history of integrity. And I am sure that within this conflict there have been maybe lapses and maybe questions and accountability, but I think that sort of trust deficit has been there within, you know, within the entire society, whether it's administration, whether it's the forces, and whether it's each other. You know, so I think this is one of the fallouts of a conflict that hasn't been obviously curtailed at appropriate time as it should have been. You know, we all agreed to that fact that, you know, it's gone on longer than it should. But when I spoke to the people that I'm talking about in Assam Rifles, they were very clear about their non-partisan role in this, you know, and the fact that the numbers that they gave me of how irrespective of the community, and they gave me the numbers on the Meiteis and the Kuki communities, have benefited from not just rehabilitation but relief work and have been given passage of way. The difference between both the communities was about 1,570 people. You know, so there is obviously, you know, I'm nobody to say that you don't have any doubts towards them. You obviously have reasons for, and I respect that. But, you know, this would be my limited take for it because, you know, I look at the defense forces in a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. But then it's still the thing is that the AR thing, with the AR, what is going on here right now, I mean, we're keeping those things aside because you don't want to answer on it, as this may sound a bit controversial. But then another thing is like, even Brinda claimed that the tentacles of the drug mafia, the drug cartel, reached the corridors of the parliament. And then this is another controversial topic. So what's your take on it?
You know, this country has an ability to say that we have no freedom of speech, yet we cast aspersions on anybody and anywhere where we feel like without any real proof. You know, so I would take these statements with a pinch of salt, and I would wait for proper investigations to happen. There is a time and a place for everything. You know, while a conflict like this is on its way, it's you know, these are not things that you hurry into. And I'm sure, you know, with the kind of accountability that Manipur has asked for at this point and will continue to ask for, I'm sure things will come out in the open. But it obviously is also, something that you can't deny that, and I am not casting any aspersion on any government, but the fact remains that you cannot have such sort of narcotics nexuses without on-ground support, and there is, it is very deep-seated. And that is not possible without the kind of, environment. And no, without the kind of conducive environment. But I wouldn't jump the gun and, agree with what she said.
Thank you very much for reflecting on my questions. And actually, I'm a big fan of yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So like, there is limited time and there are so many questions, so everyone are fan of ma'am and they really want to talk to ma'am, so we better give chance to everyone. And is there anyone amongst us who give questions? Like, okay, so one by one at a time. Please introduce yourself. And
Ma'am, I'm Suraj Kumar of Pol Science Department, 4th semester. My question to you is, of the many narratives about the unsatisfactory role the central government is playing in the recent violence, one narrative coming up recently is about the government of India taking up developmental activities in the Sindh state of Myanmar. In order not to harm the interests of this group in the Sindh state, the government did not take any unnecessary steps to control the violence. How far is this narrative valid according to you?
Just to understand your question, you're saying that there were development initiatives in Myanmar?
Yeah, like the Kaladan project and also the gas pipeline connecting from the Sindh state to that of Gaya in Bihar.
So you're saying that brings a question to your mind as to what is their role in Myanmar vis-a-vis this conflict?
Yeah.
So the Kaladan project actually is not a new project. It's only about like 18 years delayed. The Kaladan project is also not a complete project. The first cargo, the cargo movement that happened was in May of this year. And that was from Calcutta to Sitwe Airport. And it's called multimodal. The reason it's called multimodal is from Sitwe, the road goes up into Mizoram and Guwahati. This was envisioned to give India the kind of security alternative that it needs because of our very ill-imaginedly cut Chicken's Neck, which is a 22-kilometer wide landmass. Therefore, if something, God forbid, was ever to happen to it, there would be no way to reach the northeast. So this was imagined many, many years ago, but because of the delays and because of the change in dispensation in Myanmar, and this is one of their official reasons that licenses were delayed, they were not being able to move forward. The road goes through Rakhine and Chin. These areas are not very safe. Our engineers have been kidnapped, they've been killed. So it's a 100-kilometer road network, which would be amazing if we had it, but unfortunately it goes through these troubled areas. So the construction of that would probably take really a long time. But that has absolutely nothing to do with what has happened in Manipur, because this was already an ongoing thing for the last 15 years. Secondly, on the contrary, China has a gas pipeline that comes through, which is running parallel to the northeast, We also understand that one of our major policies is the Act East policy. We are highly dependent on it if we want to be the global leader. We talk about the global south, we talk about being the balancing power between the east and the west. Therefore, this is one of the most important incentives. So Chinese revisionism has to be countered with the kind of infrastructural developments that they are making in Myanmar. I can go about this for a while, but I'll take another minute. The thing about Myanmar is, that ever since the junta has come in, the question has been how should people react to it. Now, China is a friend, US has put sanctions. This is all, this is all leading up to a very disastrous situation. India, on the contrary, has played a really good move wherein it has kept neutral and not come under any pressure and kept its doors of communication open. Therefore, if you remember, during the first week, I think maybe first 2 weeks when the conflict in Manipur broke out, a notification from the Myanmarese government was issued warning its residents living in India, in Myanmar specifically, to not indulge in poppy cultivation and to not be a cause of any communal violence. That coming out as an official notification from a government, accepting that there are illegal immigrants causing their own citizens, causing communal disharmony, is a huge diplomatic win. So on the contrary, the relationship that India has kept with Myanmar is possibly a positive move for us.
Can we have our next question? Anyone?
Hi, ma'am. My name is Bonchun Kumsam, and I'm from the Science Department. And the questions I would like to know from you is that, is the ongoing conflict doing here, it's being sponsored by an external forces, or if so, then is what the communities is what the communities a victim in this sponsored aggression, and is the ongoing conflict a tip of iceberg for their geopolitical strategy by the external forces?
That's a very good question. So yes, I think if there isn't a resolution to this conflict, and like I said, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. It's going to take a lot of time because trust deficits are not that easy to build. These fault lines last for a lifetime. But of course, if there can be at least some consensus on the issues that concern both the parties, then the chances of this being the tip of the iceberg would minimize. But if that consensus does not happen, at least on the issues that are a priority to either of these communities, this very well could be the iceberg that you're talking about. But when we talk about external agencies, I have a very simple take on it. It's happened before. The longest running insurgency in the Northeast had tactical support from across the border. One of the reasons that it had this sort of support, because passage of way was given by, again, communities that were considered cousin communities. We, unfortunately, are in a very Israel-like situation geographically. We're surrounded by countries that have their own problems. We have the northwestern frontier now that is in a flux and closed off for us. We have the northeastern frontier, which has Myanmar, which is fairly unstable, and we see a growing influence of China. We have Bangladesh on the brink of elections, and I am very hopeful that Sheikh Hasina will come back. It's in another 3 or 4 months. US has put sanctions on Bangladesh. The reason it has put sanctions is because it's not very happy with Sheikh Hasina. Therefore, Awami League officials have also been sanctioned with visa restrictions and all sorts of other sanctions. What this then does is this sort of external interference changes governance that are natural, that are elected in a democratic system, having then counter effects on us. Because any of these countries with their dispensation changing will have no doubt about this, will have an influx of immigrants on our doorstep. These countries are also not very well equipped to deal with the climate change that is happening. The estimated amount of refugees that we possibly are getting from Bangladesh in the next 10 years with a 0.5 degree temperature change and the loss of the landmass is about 10 million. So this is all going to cause some amount of disturbances in these countries. For example, if Pakistan was to break up, where do you think they'd go? They aren't going to go to Afghanistan, If Myanmar was to destabilize further or have further Chinese influence, what is going to happen with their already active insurgent groups? They're not going to go anywhere. This is where they're going to come. If Bangladesh changes its dispensation, again, the immigration is going to be here. So to answer your question, it's interesting because, we are going to have multiple problems. And, the hand of external agencies is always going to be a problem in the Northeast, because if we realize the value of the Northeast, do you think they don't realize it? Let me tell you, historically also, when the British were withdrawing from India, they wanted to continue keeping the Northeast as a crown colony because they had realized the kind of, they realized the kind of strategic value that they had at that point. There wasn't a state in South Asia and Southeast Asia that could be a base for the British or the Americans, and they wanted to keep the Northeast as a base for the same, So this kind of geopolitical game, that's why, Bertil Littner has that book called The Great Game East.
Can we have the mic that side, please?
Good evening, ma'am. The question that I raised earlier is that it seems that in this two-day convention, we have acknowledged and reaffirmed how important it is to have dialogue in a democratic society. But in the present situation of Manipur, between the two communities in conflict, the Meitei community seems to some extent ready to have dialogue. But on the other hand, the other community does not seem so. Rather, they seem to put forth some conditions, that the CM should be removed, all those things. So how do you think the two communities can be brought to a dialogue, from a non-Manipuri perspective? I mean, not from the Kuki point of view or the Meitei point of view. So how do you think the two communities can be brought to dialogue? Also, the central government seems to be holding separate meetings, for one community and then for other community. And while the everyday reality is there seems to be exchange of fires and regular intercourse. So how long would we be entrapped in this kind of situation while not holding a dialogue, So I wanted to give some elaboration.
I'm glad you said non-Manipuri perspective because that's all I have. So my non-Manipuri perspective on this, on your question is that, yes, there is a difference of discourse, and there's no denying that. Because I've met representations from the Manipuri community in Delhi, and I've met representations from the Kuki community in Delhi, and the asks are completely different. The question was also about, would you like to meet together? And it seemed like one community didn't, and one community did. And it was very evident to all of us. There was a panel of very senior stakeholders in this committee, and it was very evident that at this point, well, at least I'm talking about like 2 months ago, that there was no meeting point. And one hoped that as time went on, that meeting point would come. Having said that, I have seen a little bit of change, maybe it's minuscule. People are getting tired, and conflict cannot go on forever without having at least a segment of society that decides that, okay, enough is enough. You'll have people who have vested interests, you'll have the fringe element that have something to gain out of this, and they will continue it, but then it becomes, a community responsibility to say, no, enough is enough, we don't support you anymore. The problem comes when a community cannot independently raise their voice, and I have seen this very often, that, individually, privately, people will say, oh, we agree with you, dialogue is necessary. The minute they're with their community, they won't say that because they probably get alienated or isolated, So this is a big problem. As per your question about what is the government having these dialogues for, the fact is nobody wants to sit together. Therefore, just to even get an assessment of what people want, what space are they going to cede, what are they hell-bent on, you have to engage them. Also, you see, engagements happen on multiple different levels. So engagement can be with CSOs, NGOs in India, the government of India, so on and so forth. The government of India has to have these independent conversations. The reason it has to have these independent conversations is because they have their own criterias of analyzing the situation. And sometimes when there is that kind of privacy, you create a bond. So like I said in my talk also, that we can talk about disarming, we can talk about dialogue, but there's no point if there's no trust. And at this point, that trust building exercise has to happen not just between you and the other person, but also the governments and the organizations that they are dealing with. And I think that is what they are doing at this point. I hope that answers your question.
So we'll have 3 more questions. The first one will be the man with the blue shirt. Is it blue? I don't even know.
Teal.
Teal.
To be exact.
Hello, ma'am. My answer to that question was already answered for others, so I would like another question. Yeah, I think the government of India is turning blind eye on this particular issue. I think it's time to realize that the Manipur situation that we're facing right now, it's more of narco-terrorism, it's more of cross-border terrorism, I think, and the government of Manipur needs to emphasize this on this particular topic in central government, and central government needs to, I think they really need to, take this matter seriously. Yeah.
So is that a statement or a question for me?
I think what's your take on this one?
So the way I look at it, and I follow these things fairly closely, even from the political realm, there are a lot of things that you and me will never know as laymen. You will never know what's happening behind the scenes, and that is incredibly important to understand, that we're not privy to private conversations, and sometimes those private conversations behind the scene negotiations and interventions are very important. Also, in terms of what is happening with narco-terrorism, what is happening with illegal infiltration, they have more information than we ever will. But like I said in my talk, unless you have trust, you can't build dialogue. If you can't build dialogue, you can't do anything that you want to do, which is either disarm or, come to a consensus, if you don't have trust, you're not even going to cede space to each other. So I think these are the things that the government is also trying to do in terms of trust building exercises and being able to approach the situation in such a way. A lot of people said, oh, why don't we send forces in and wrap this up? Do you know the implications of that? You will isolate a complete community. And if you isolate a complete community, the exact very thing that you don't want is going to be emphasized. So coming for a government to come on very hard-handedly on its own citizens is usually not a very good game plan. We've seen the repercussions of it in the 80s, in the 90s, in the Northeast itself. But having said that, of course, this is a problem. But that's why I said in my talk as well, you solve the centrality of the problem, which is land distribution issues, and it's an urgent problem. You will also automatically solve a lot of the other problems like illegal infiltration, like drug trafficking, like we made those suggestions about making SEZs, wherein populations can settle in those areas. Or in my opinion also, and I think this is my public opinion, I think everybody knows it, that I think the demand for even scheduled tribe status is a very, very valid demand. These are your resolutions, one way or another, it's for you to decide, These are your resolutions for larger problems and larger solutions. So once those happen, these things have a better chance of being resolved than they have a chance of being resolved at this point.
towards the end of the question and answer session, they just informed that the mic was not loud enough, so I have to give the other mic. And can we have the mic to wait before him? Can we have the mic to the lady behind?
Hi, ma'am. It's me, Suchitra Mayingwam. So, before asking my question, I want to start by saying this statement that, ma'am, you are so beautiful.
I like to come to Manipur more.
So, ma'am, my question is, when people are suffering for more than 4 months and there is no hope for the restoration of peace still, will the peaceful dialogue negotiation really workable when the one central government who will act as a mediator did not act really in a very good way, that the people even have confidence whether they are taking the side of others, or in this situation will the peaceful negotiation really workable? Is it possible?
Well, first of all, I hope the negotiation is peaceful.
Yeah, but ma'am, when the heart of the people are all deeply embedded with the intention to take revenge of their losing their near and near ones, will it be workable? This is my question.
So your question is on negotiations.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So first of all, there are multiple levels of negotiations. I believe that even right now there are informal negotiations going on within the state government, which includes the chairman of the hill councils. There are negotiations going on in Delhi also, and I am not quite sure what sort of a stance and what sort of incentive the CSOs in Manipur have taken for negotiations. But like I say, that, for negotiations you can talk till kingdom come, but what's the point if you don't trust each other? So negotiations also have to be built on trust, that, sort of trust development of that, and that sort of mutual trust exercise has to come very slowly and has to come with the right individuals. We also have to be able to identify people from each community who are representative of generally what the communities are willing to cede on and not cede on, who are articulate enough and sensible enough to be able to represent an entire community. And I think that is going to be an important role, but it's never one negotiating committee that solves a problem. It's multiple, because there are multiple problems. But of course, unless, like I say, unless there's trust, there's no point, discussing. If you and me are at odds, we're just not going to be in the mood to come to any consensus. So I think it's a long way away, but that doesn't mean that, the effort should not be made. Well, that's an incentive, that is with the communities, how fast do you want it? How fast can you organize yourself? Can you really, like one of the things was about, we saw the different CSOs representing today. Is there any sort of consensus amongst them? Do we know what our demands are? Is there consensus on what is it that one really wants? These are the questions that can only be answered if there is a consensus, and I don't know if that sort of organization is happening. I'm in touch with a lot of people who are doing wonderful work, but it's like 50 organizations I'm talking to. There isn't an umbrella group. So who are you going to choose to represent yourself? So these are very complicated problems, but I also think a lot of these are really just problems made by us, And if we resolve, to have an umbrella body that represents our demands, maybe things will move further, faster.
So the next question, can we have I'll have two last questions, ma'am, because one from this side and one from that side. So can we have the mic handed over to sir? Yes.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, when I was in Delhi School of Economics, there is saying among us, Manipur has been integrated into India politically, but the government of India does not try to integrate Manipur into Indian Union emotionally. So that's very much reflected in the failure to control the militant groups of the other community in a very effective way. And what is your take on this?
If you've seen a lot of my talks, I've started really from the colonial legacy of this sort of isolation, not just psychological isolation, but geographical isolation. When we talk about geographical isolation, it had an impact on how psychologically we considered the Northeast so distant. The policies that were laid by the colonialists ran and still run through, the decades post-independence. We should have changed them long ago because a lot of the policies were based on what was at ease of administration for them. It wasn't based on any sort of great ethnographic or anthropological perceptions. Therefore, it's not the government of India, so as to say, especially not the present government of India. And I'll always be biased a little bit because, like I said, I've been traveling these areas for the last 15 years. I have seen, the difference in, and I'm not just talking about Manipur, I'm of course talking about all of the region. I have seen a difference in not just infrastructure, not just security, but also how it has become a part of mainstream consciousness for the rest of the country. The Northeast has come on the map. Today, people, when they want to travel in the North Indians want to travel. Earlier on, they'd go to Goa, they'd go to South India, they'd go to Cork. Now, suddenly they wanted to come to the Northeast and explore the Northeast, and you were really cool if you went to the Northeast, and for the next 3 months I had to hear their stories, So, things had changed. There's a 74% reduction in insurgency in the Northeast. Even the rehabilitation processes have been changed by the Home Ministry, and I have gone through them, and they are spectacular. Let me give you an example. Earlier on, they'd say, you surrender, you give your weapons, you come back, we'll give you a gamcha, we'll, do a welcome back ceremony, and then they'd forget about it, and they'd give them a lump sum. Now it is so comprehensive that they put a fixed deposit in your bank account against which you can take a loan to start a business. And you can access that fixed loan once your business has started, and I think there's some 5-year or 8-year sort of tenure. So these are things that, these kind of processes are not thought out, just from the top of your head, These are very minute, detailed changes. We've never had the kind of arms being surrendered. Again, I'm not talking about Manipur, I'm talking about the Northeast, that have been surrendered in the last 8 years in the Northeast. We've not had the kind of agreements and historical colonial state boundary resolutions that could have been done long ago that have been done now, So I think, this sort of psychological deficit that you talk about and geographical deficit you talk about is not a recent thing. This has been there, since the colonial times, and it has been our lack of interest and our policy of exclusion and isolation that we carried from pre-independence to post-independence that created this difference. See, as it is, the British were terrible cartographers. They made a mess in the northwestern frontier, pulling the boundary. Then they come here and they make a mess here also, you know. It was a lawyer who pulled these lines. So, you know, how much can you expect? So we've been left in a very difficult position, you know, and these are positions we can't change. Also, a lot of the benefits that we see today, a lot of the reservations that we see today, a lot of this sort of identity politics that we see today are again very new to our civilization in terms of your civilization is not, your culture is not 75 years old, you know, it's longer than that, you know. A lot of these bifurcations, like even the word tribal was only included in the late 19th century census. The word animism was again included only in the late 19th century census. We never had these bifurcations before. Even the benefits that today we see as benefits, you know, were given for different reasons because these were considered untamed lands, therefore they were excluded. So what was considered excluded areas because they were too wild and they needed to be kept away from the ambit of development, today we consider a privilege saying, oh, that is going to preserve our unique identity. You know, so we need some self-reflection as well.
So this is going to be the last question for the day. The last question, please.
Hi, Rami. Good evening, Rami. My name is Ishwar, and thanks for all the answers you have given, and also thanks for all the questions. But actually, I had a lot of questions, but then, you know, you have touched on everything. Like, so it's going to be a bit different. So now we have all asked questions, right? Now, I want to ask you, like, do you ask yourself when you go to sleep or when you are in deep thinking about the situation in Manipur, and like, what kind of questions do you ask yourself? You know, like, for way forward, you know, do you ask yourself, like, okay, you know, do you have your own internal conversations and questions? Because, see, it's been like 4 months, right? And we have been expecting peace or any other development. Nothing, right? It's been like waiting for Godot. It's never going to come. That's what I feel. It's never going to come. Peace is never going to come. People say in terms of like years, but the trust that we have lost, and like if you see it politically also, there is no will, right? Because the cookies said they won't come to a negotiating table until Biren is removed, CM Biren is removed. The center is unwilling to remove Biren. And the CSOs, they are not interested, like you said, one community is not interested at all in talking, right? And I have dropped this message like in like chat and everything. So from Manipur, like from the Meitei community, at least I can, you know, like give 3 names top of my head, like who the Kuki community are willing to accept if they come. Like one, for example, is Bablu Loitongbam. Okay? Any Kuki will accept him, like in a panel. Now I forgot the other 2. But seriously, like, what kind of questions do you ask yourself? Or, I mean, you should be asking yourself, right? Or at least, I don't know.
You know, you have an interesting question. If nothing else, that's an interesting question. I'll have to think about it. But, you know, I have to tell you that, you know, I do other work as well. You know, I am associated to organizations, and I have my own writing work. I have never slept so little in my life in the last 4 months, because I think this, I read this, I eat this, I talk this. Every free minute that I have, I am either meeting organizations, I'm either contacting people, I'm not somebody who's really fond of being on a debate. You know, I lose my privacy. You know, this is the first time I have based my entire research on field work. This is the first time I'm not going to be able to ever, for a long time at least, go to certain areas, you know. So for me, obviously, it has had my own personal implications. But, you know, I also think about the fact that we have lost 15 years. I saw 6 years of great development. I saw kids coming back. I saw them running restaurants with, literally, these were the little things I noticed, you know, running restaurants with state-of-the-art modern furniture, you know, it was comparable to any restaurant in New York, in Delhi, in Bombay. I saw people coming back with their modern aesthetics, their education in the West, and starting small cottage industries, which was very impressively based on their own indigenous sense of aesthetics as well as their arts and crafts. Now, these things were very, very impressive to me because 15 years ago I would never see any of this. You know, there wasn't a decent restaurant to eat in, there wasn't, you know, it wasn't safe. And, you know, last 6 years we had relative peace and, you know, I saw these changes. So now when I look at this and I look at the lack of interest in looking at the bigger picture, I do wonder, you know, that what are we going to do in terms of at least having lost 15 years of perception. See, I do believe peace will come back. There is no question that peace won't come back because, you know, human beings have a threshold. You know, everybody was really excited in the first month. Everybody is, you know, if there's any way that I could possibly intervene in the kind of false narratives that circle around.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We're really grateful. And I'm so sorry that we can take no more questions due to time constraints. I'm very sorry. And I hope we all got the answer that like we are very much satisfied with the answer. And I hope everyone will be implementing whatever we have learned inside, the good things that we have learned inside. And therefore, this comes to the end of today's session with our respected ma'am, Rami Desai. And thank you everyone for joining us. And once again, I'm very sorry I can take no more questions due to time constraints. Thank you. But can I also say thank you? I know it's been a really long day and all of you have waited throughout, you know, to be able to ask these wonderful questions to me. So, lots of gratitude.